Hello, and welcome to another lesson in our series from the letter that we call the letter to the Hebrews. As we've discussed before, this was a letter of encouragement written to a group of Jewish Christians who were suffering persecution and trials to the point that they were even being tempted to give up their newfound Christian faith and return to their Jewish roots. The author, and we're not sure exactly who the author was, writes this letter. And it's like a sermon or like a theological treatise or like an argument written for a debate, trying to convince them to hold on to their newfound Christian faith. And in doing so, he's going to try to connect the dots between what they came to believe through their Jewish roots and the dots that they have heard related to Jesus and his ministry, and show how that Jesus is the fulfillment of what they learned in their Jewish background. So he's trying to help them see that Jesus is the fulfillment and that they should hold on to what they believe about Jesus as the fulfillment of their Jewish background. Now, in doing so, the writer is making the point that Jesus, the Son of God, came and took on flesh, became fully human. He taught and then was crucified, buried, and raised from the dead, and then ascended back into heaven. And this Jesus, this historical Jesus, is that one that they have been looking for, is the fulfillment of their Jewish expectations. The key word, as we've described throughout this letter, is the word better, or maybe superior. We will see the terms used as the better priest, the better sacrifice, the better temple. We've already looked into lessons that talked about him being superior to angels, superior to Moses, comparing this new with the terms of the old. Now, we also mentioned that the letter is constructed in such a way to be very similar to a Greek rhetorical argument. That is, in a debate, there would be a structure of the argument, and this letter seems to fit that pattern very well. The beginning would be the exordium. This would be the introduction. This would be the portion in which the speaker or the writer is going to get the attention of the reader or the listener, and usually in doing so will use some type of provocative statement. And as we looked at chapters 1 and the first 4 verses of chapter 2, we saw how the author begins to get their attention by saying, you know, in the past, God spoke to us through prophets and other ways, but in these days, he's spoken to us through his Son. And then he goes on and describes the Son, and the provocative statement he makes is, and this Son is superior to angels. And he laid out some Old Testament passages that showed how the Son was superior to angels. The next section in a rhetorical argument would be their narration, or the narratio. And this is an opportunity for the speaker or the writer to lay out the facts. He wants to identify the facts that he will be using and basing the arguments that he will present on. He wants to give the facts so that everybody understands the basis of the argument. And we looked in chapter 2 and 3 for that part of the argument, or that part of the presentation. And we saw that in chapter 2, verse 9, he specifically identifies the Son as being Jesus. He's talking about the Son being better than angels. And then in chapter 2, verse 9, he clearly identifies this historical Jesus, this one that they knew as a man, or they had heard about as a man, that he is in fact the Son that the author is talking about. And he identifies that this Jesus took on humanity. He briefly was made lower, a little lower than the angels. He took on humanity. And he did so that he could identify with man. And that he did identify with man in that he fully suffered, even death, in the human condition, so that he could identify with man. And by doing so, he then was enabled, qualified to become the merciful and compassionate priest. Now, as I explained in the prior lesson, following this narratio, we then would move straight into the arguments. However, the author here deviates from the pattern a little bit in that he goes back in chapters 3 and talks more about a second exordium, if you will, another opening statement, if you will, and another provocative statement. In the balance of chapter 3 and the first part of chapter 4, he again is addressing the issue of God's relationship with man, and he says man still has the opportunity to enter this rest. And he is trying to get their attention that you're seeking relationship with God. You're seeking his presence. And man has given that opportunity. It still has that opportunity. And he's going to show that Jesus is the means by which you can enter that rest. That this message of rest, this message of opportunity of rest, has come through the Son, the historical man that they know of as Jesus. And that closes out that second opening. And then in the lesson today, we begin with the proposition. The proposition in chapter 4, verses 14 and 16, will lay the beginning for the body of the argument, if you will. And we're going to see the arguments made from chapter 4 all the way through chapter 10. This section, this argument section, is laid out in what some writers call the book with bookends. I want to read to you the verses that we'll begin with today. Then I want to read to you the verses that he concludes with, so you'll see the bookend nature of these verses. That is how he structures his argument. He states what he's going to show, and then he states the conclusion. Chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Now, listen to chapter 10, verses 19 through 23. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, and by a new and living way open for us through the curtain, that is his body, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. That's the bookends. Those are the bookends, and now in between will be the meat of the argument. And the central theme all the way through is we have this high priest, and through this high priest we can enter God's presence and find that rest that he was talking about. Okay, let's begin our lesson then. Let's go back to chapter 4, verse 14, and look at it with a little more detail. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. In verse 14, he gives us a very brief but important description of this high priest. Now, he has mentioned the idea, or he has brought up the idea of Jesus being the high priest before in chapter 2, verse 17. For this reason, he, talking about the Son, had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. And then in chapter 3, verse 1, he wrote, Therefore, holy brothers and sisters who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest. So he's already brought up the idea that Jesus, the Son of God, this historical man that they knew about either personally or by the testimony of eyewitnesses, this Jesus is now our high priest. And he wants to come back and with this couple of verses stating the proposition, he wants to begin to explain what this means and why that should give us reason to hold on to our faith in him. In this brief sentence in verse 14, he gives us three observations about Jesus. Number one, he is great. He is our great high priest. He is great. This emphasizes his superiority. Now, the author's already made the case that the Son is superior to angels, and we've already gone, in chapter 3, we talked about his being superior to Moses. And now he wants us to understand that this Jesus, as our high priest, is superior or is greater than the high priest that they knew of in their Jewish faith. He is great, his superiority. Verse 3 of chapter 3, the author has already written, Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses, just as the builder of the house has greater honor than the house himself. He's going to explore this idea of being the superior high priest in greater detail, but he just starts off by making the observation, he is the great high priest. Second, the second attribute of this high priest is that he ascended into heaven. Now, this puts the emphasis on the fact that he has been exalted. That is, he has now taken his place in heaven. He is now with God. He is in a place where he is exalted. He is in God's very presence. Now, back during that time, there was a lot of debate amongst Jews as well as secular writers about the nature of heaven. And many described levels of heaven, whether there were seven heavens or 3 heavens or 9 heavens. There were several different descriptions as to what the word heaven means. A couple of things seem to be in common. One is there was a reference to the heaven, at least one level of heaven, the highest level of heaven, as being the place where God resides, as being the throne room, if you will, of heaven. Some suggest that this statement that he has ascended into heaven is making a reference to his ascension. That is, heavens being the skies, and they stood there outside of Jerusalem and watched him rise up into the skies. So when the writer says he ascended into heaven, it may be referring to that testimony of those believers who stood there and watched him ascend through the heavens, the skies, or it may be a reference to the fact that this Jesus, as our high priest, is presently in the heavens. He ascended into the heavens, into the very presence of God, where he now sits at the right hand of the Father. Or it could mean both. But he says he is the great high priest, and he has ascended into the heavens. This whole theory of ascending into heavens is going to be talked about again as well in later chapters. And then he says he is the Son of God. Okay, we have a great high priest who ascended into heaven, comma, now, who is that? Jesus, the Son of God. Now, in chapter 2, verse 9, the author identified Jesus, this historical man, as being the Son. But here he uses the title Son of God. This is the first time in Hebrews that this title is used. And he is saying that this Jesus, this historical man that you know, that you either knew or you have heard about from the testimony of eyewitnesses, he is the Son of God, and he is our high priest. And now he's going, this great high priest who ascended into heaven. This title reminds the reader of what the author has already said, that this Son was very God, the exact representation of God, the radiance of his glory, and he is very man, took on the human condition and suffered even death on a cross. This demonstrates why he's superior, because he is very God and very man. Having made that statement, let us recognize we have this great high priest who has ascended into heaven, even Jesus the Christ. Since we have this great high priest who is at the right hand of the Father, he then gives them the exhortation. Let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. Let us hold on. The writer recognizes many of the people that are reading his letter are suffering. They're being tempted. They're wavering in their faith. And he says, recognize we have this high priest and hold on. Hold on to your the faith that you have professed. To hold on is talking about to grasp, to clasp, to cling to. It's an active word, not a passive term. Make effort to hold on to the faith that we profess. The Greek word professed is also translated confession. The idea of confession is you have made a profession. You have made a confession. Now hold on to it. Keep it. Hold on to it. Let's go on to verse 15. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Further description of this high priest. And he does the describing by using a negative and then a positive. He starts with a negative. And to emphasize this, he uses a double negative. We do not have a high priest who is unable. There's the double negative. We do not have a high priest who is unable. The reverse of that, or the clear implication of that is we do have a high priest who is able. Okay? But he states it in the negative, again, bringing them along with him. We do not have a high priest who is unable. It's almost as though the writer recognizes that the reader's mind is thinking about what he's saying and immediately raises a red flag. Okay? You're telling me that this Jesus is God who became very man. Yet you're telling me that this Jesus who is very man has become a high priest. And the Jewish mind, now we wouldn't understand this fully because not having a Jewish background, the Jewish mind would say, wait a minute, how can this Jesus be a high priest? A priest can only be one who comes from the tribe of Levi and is a descendant of Aaron. This Jesus, we know, was from the tribe of Judah, a descendant of David. He wasn't of the right lineage. How could he be such a high priest? And he wants to explain this. And he says, he's a different kind of high priest. First of all, And it goes further, though. Not just the fact he's not from the lineage of David, but as a human, how can he be any different than I am? How can he be this greater priest? How can he be this superior priest if he was very human? And to explain that, he starts off with a negative statement. He says, he's not one who's limited because he has experienced what we suffered. He can be a high priest and be a merciful priest. He wants to he wants them to understand that it is that very humanity. While that might seem to be an obstacle for the Jewish reader, this very humanity is what makes him superior, inasmuch as he was very God, but he is also very man. And as being very man, he has suffered like we suffer, and therefore he is able to sympathize and empathize with the way we feel. So he's saying it is that divine nature that gives him that superiority. And we'll come back and talk about the humanity side in just a minute. But it is that divine nature that gives him that superiority. We do not have one who can't sympathize with us, but rather we do have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. It is this very humanity that might be a problem for you, he's saying to the Jewish reader, that makes him the superior priest. Now, the word sympathize, in the NIV, it's translated empathize. The Greek word is the root word from which we get sympathy. But the Greek word carries with it much more than simply sympathy as we understand it in the English language. In the English language, sympathy means an emotion that I feel. I feel for you. I identify with your feelings. He says, no, the NIV translates this empathize, because empathy is when I not only feel, but I respond. Okay? And in the Greek, this word that's translated sympathy or empathy is an active word. It's going beyond simply having a feel. I feel for you, but it's more than that. I feel for you, and I am active in my support of you, in my help of you. And so he says this very humanity is that which enables him to be able to not only understand and feel where we as humans are, but to be moved to the point of helping us. And that's the affirmative statement. But we have one who was tempted in every way, just like we are. He's experienced all the temptations, the situations of human condition, yet he did not sin. Now, we need to pay attention here to a couple little things. First of all, he says, we have one who has been tempted. That's in the perfect tense. Completed. He has been, it's over and done. He did not sin. He has conquered the temptations of humanity. He did not sin. He is victorious over the test of the temptation. He's not. See, this is where the Jewish reader is having his problem. Thinking of God being very removed. How can he understand me? Speaking of man, he's just like us. How can he be a priest? He's not a member of the tribe of Levi. And so the writer's trying to address it and say, no, he is not as the son of man, as son of God, removed, because he took on human flesh. He took on human flesh. He's tempted in every way, so he does empathize with us. And then in verse 16, he addresses the other part of the problem they've raised. When we get down to verse 5, chapter 5, he'll satisfy the other problem that he's raised. But he's saying, this one who is very God But he's not, by being very God, not removed. He is a very God who has experienced every temptation, and he did not sin. He is our high priest. And because of that, the exhortation, let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. He's very God. He's exalted. He's ascended into heaven. He's sitting at the right hand of the Father. Yet he's not so removed that he can't empathize with us, because in his humanness, he was tempted in every way. He did not sin. So we have the confidence. We are invited to come into God's presence. We are invited to come into God's presence so that we, with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace. He knows and he understands. Now, the Jews understood that only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies, where they understood the presence of God resided. And only the high priest could go in there once a year on the Day of Atonement. This writer is saying, because we now have this new high priest, we can go into the very presence of God, the very throne room of God, boldly. Now, look how that exhortation is written. Look at the tense of the verbs. Let us then approach. Approach is in the present tense. The present tense suggests a present and ongoing continuous action. Let us now and continually go to God's throne, the throne of grace. Now, the ancient Jewish rabbis taught that God had two thrones, one of mercy and one of judgment. But they could not recognize, they said that they knew this because God was both merciful and just. But they couldn't reconcile these two attributes. They thought that perhaps God had two thrones to display two aspects of his character. On one throne he showed judgment, and on the other throne he would show mercy. But here, in light of the finished work that Jesus did, was tempted in every way, did not sin, faithful unto death on a cross, provided the atoning sacrifice, resurrected and ascended back into heaven. Based upon this, in light of the finished work of Jesus, we see that mercy and just judgment are reconciled to one throne, the throne of grace. And we can go to that throne of grace, to the very presence of God, boldly, assured of his mercy and his love. One writer wrote it this way: boldly does not mean proudly, arrogantly, or with presumption. Boldly means we may come constantly. Boldly means we may come without reservation. Boldly means we may come freely, without fancy words. Boldly means we can come with confidence. Boldly means we should come with persistence, because we have this high priest. He was very God, Son of God, but he's not so removed that he can't identify with us, because he took on flesh and became and endured every temptation we endured and did not sin. He provides us that opportunity of rest. We can go to the throne knowing that he is there interceding for us. But I mentioned the other problem that the Jewish reader would have. One is, if he is God, he's too far removed. We've tried to resolve that. Now, the other one that I mentioned was that if he was man, how could he possibly be a better priest? How could he possibly be a priest at all? How could Jesus possibly be a priest at all? Because he wasn't of the lineage of David. In chapter 5, beginning with chapter 5, the writer wants to address that obstacle that the Jewish mind would have. he starts off by describing the priesthood in general. Every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in the matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifice for sins. Okay, he's talking about, in the Jewish understanding of things, a priest. First of all, every priest is selected from among the people. Now, two aspects of this. One, from among the people. He is human just like his parishioners are. The priest is another human. Okay? And then he says he is selected. Now, the idea of being selected means someone else has designated you. You don't, when you use the word selected, you're not saying that you select yourself. Someone else has selected you. And of course, the Jews understood that was that was God. And God selected the descendants of Aaron. He selected Aaron and then his descendants. But the first qualification of a high priest is that he is one among the people, and Jesus fit that role, and that he is selected. He is designated by God. Now, the role of the priest was to represent the people before God, the writer said, to offer gifts and to offer sacrifices for sin. Now, the idea of gifts and offerings, some suggest the gifts referred to the cereal offerings, the wheat offering, the drink offerings, those type of things. And then the sacrifices for sin would be the blood offerings that were offered as atonement sacrifices. In Hebrews, in this letter, offerings and sacrifices are used interchangeably. So while the Jewish mind would have made a distinction, he's not necessarily making those distinctions here. Now, he says that the priest is the one who is to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. And he says, the writer says, he, the priest, is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. Since he is one of them, he can then be gentle with the people. And he talks about, he describes the people as being those who are ignorant and who are going astray. Barclay explains this in a note. Let me read that. We must note that the Jews were always quite clear when thinking at its highest that the sins for which the sacrifice could atone were sins of ignorance. The deliberate sin did not find atonement in the sacrifice. So the role of the priest was to provide sacrifices for the sins of ignorance. And so what the writer is saying is that the priest, because he's human and he understands how these things happen, because he himself has these things happening in his life, he is able to be gentle with those who have these sins of ignorance. He's able to work with these people who are ignorant and those who go astray. The idea of going astray means one who's wandered off the path but wants to get back on the path. He's able to be gentle with them because he's had those problems too. So he's one of the people who can be gentle with them because he understands them. That's very important for the priest in the human setting. And of course, we've made the case that Jesus came and took on humanity so that he would have this ability that the human priest had. But Jesus was tempted at every point that man is tempted, but did not sin. And that becomes the difference. Verse 3 reads, this is why he has to offer sacrifices. I'm going to go back to verse 2. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and who are going astray, since he himself is subject to those weaknesses. But it's because of those weaknesses, this, verse 3, is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. Now, what would happen is that the priest had to, before, when he went to make an offering for the sin of the people on the Day of Atonement, before he could do that, he had to offer a sacrifice for his own sins. He had to bring a sacrifice for his own sins. Leviticus 16:11. Aaron shall bring a bull for his own sin offering to make atonement for himself and his household, and he is to slaughter the bull for his own sin offering. So he's making the case the priest in the Jewish sense, in the human condition, is able to be gentle with the ignorant and those who are wandering because he understands, because he's weak like they are, but because he has this weakness, he has to bring the sacrifice for his own sins. He has to offer the sacrifice for his own sins. And no one takes this honor on himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. And he says, and no person assumes the role of being a priest. No human assumes the role of being a priest. You have to be selected, appointed, called by God, and God made that calling by designating the priests to come from the descendants of Aaron. And the Jew in his mind is saying, then how could Jesus possibly do this? How could Jesus, this man, possibly do this? Well, the author is trying to put this all together, and he says, well, first of all, remember, he was Son of God who took on humanity. So he provided the sacrifice for the sins once and for all, unlike the human high priest who has to continue to offer sacrifices for himself. But then he goes on to explain this idea of Jesus being the priest. In the same way, Jesus did not take on himself glory of becoming a high priest. See, he could hear the mind of the Jewish reader saying, if Jesus was a man, then how could he become priest unless he took it on for himself? And the author says, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest. But God said to him, and then he quotes from Psalm 2, you are my son, and I have become your father. See, Jesus was more than just a man. He was the Son of God. Now, he quotes from Psalm 2, and of course, in our dispensation, we know, and those readers of that at that time would have read the gospel accounts, and they knew that when Jesus was baptized, the voice from heaven said, you are my son. So Jesus didn't take this role of priest on himself as a human, but rather, number one, God has designated him. God has said, you are my son. Today I have become your father. And he says in another place. Now, notice he's quoting these, he's attributing these quotes to God. God said, you are my son. And in another place, this another place happens to be a reference to Psalm 110. In Psalm 110:4, and the quote is, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. The author is saying, and just as God has said about the Messiah, that was a messianic psalm, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. This should also be attributed to Jesus, the one who has been designated as God's son. Now, what does this mean about designated a priest in the order of Melchizedek? In chapter 6 and 7, the author is going to go into great detail explaining all of this. Unfortunately, our lessons won't necessarily go into those chapters, so let me just stop and explain a little bit of it to you here. And you are very familiar with the Genesis account of Abraham and Lot splitting up, Lot moving to Sodom, Lot and his family being captured by the warring neighbors and taken into captivity, Abraham putting together his small army and rescuing Lot and his family. And as they're coming back, they encounter Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek was given the title the King of Salem, and he is also in Genesis given the title the Priest of the Most High God. Now, what do we know about Melchizedek? Well, we know that his name, Melchizedek, means King of Righteousness. We know that the name King of Salem means King of Peace. And that's all we know. We don't know anything about his mother and dad. We don't know anything about his early years. We don't know anything about his later years. We don't know anything about his death. But he was considered by God to be a high priest of the Most High, the priest of the Most High God. And Abraham, when he encounters him, he worships and he gives a tithe to this priest, who is he recognizes as the priest of the Most High God. The writer is saying that Jesus is a priest in the same way that Melchizedek was a priest. Now, how was Melchizedek a priest? By lineage? No. We don't think about his lineage. He was a priest because God said he was. He was a priest because God selected him. He was a priest because God called him. And here the writer, in quoting the psalm and attributing it to Jesus, is saying that Jesus is a high priest, is a priest, not in the way that the priests of their day were priests, that is, not by being of the lineage of Levi or of Aaron, but he was a priest because he was designated to be the priest by God, designated in the order of Melchizedek. He was an eternal, forever, he'd be priest forever. We have no beginning and no ending of Melchizedek. He was a priest forever. And the writer is saying that Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek. So, yes, he is a priest, even though he wasn't a descendant of Levi or of Aaron. That answers that one question in the mind of the Jewish reader. And yes, he is a priest who understands us because he is not removed like they understood God to be. He was very God, yes, but he was God who took on humanity and was tempted in every way that we are, yet he did not sin. So he is very God and very man, and thereby he is, yes, with the Father. He is in the heavens. He is at the right hand of the Father. But at the same time, he understands us. He knows us, just like the earthly priest knows his parishioners because he has experiences with them. But unlike the earthly priest, he does not have to offer sacrifices for sin anymore because he did not sin. He was the atoning sacrifice, and he now can give us that entrance to the rest that he was talking about before. And we then should come with confidence. We should hold on to what we've professed, and we should come in confidence to the throne of God, to the presence of God, because we have this high priest there with us. The very conclusion then of the passage in chapter 5. During the days of Jesus' life on earth. Now he's been talking about this throne room in heaven and our priest being there and understanding us and able to help us. Now he shifts the attention of the reader back to Jesus' earthly life. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. and he was heard because of his reverent submission. This very possibly is a reference to Jesus' prayers in the Garden of Gethsemane. We know there in the Garden of Gethsemane on that night that he was crucified, Jesus prayed, if it's possible that this cup pass from me, the death, the suffering. But if it's not possible, thy will be done. The writer describes it there as prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him. His crying out to the one who could save him. Barclay tells us that the rabbis had a saying, there are three kinds of prayers, each loftier than the preceding: prayer, crying, and tears. Prayer is made in silence, crying with a raised voice, but tears overcome all things. Jesus knew even the desperate prayers of tears. In his humanness, Jesus prayed those desperate prayers of tears. And the writer says, and he was heard. Now he's praying to the one who could save him from death. And then says, and his prayers were heard because of his reverent submission. Now, in our human mind, we'd say that's a contradiction. If he was praying to be saved from death, and we know he died, how could we say that his prayers have been heard? But that's the human understanding of it. The writer wants us to understand he was praying, and his prayer was, if it's your will. And God heard his prayer, but God had a plan, and he was obedient to that plan, even death on the cross. We've said before, the writer has told us before, it was his suffering, even death on the cross, that was the means of perfecting, completing, finalizing, bringing him to the completion of the plan. So even though the answer was not that he avoided death, even though the answer was that he would die, Jesus would go to the cross. Jesus' reverent submission, whatever your will is, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, if you will. And once, he goes on to say, and once made perfect, once made complete, once everything was finalized, he became the source of eternal salvation. He provided the atoning sacrifice. He provided that sacrifice that was needed for all who obey him. And he was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek. He was designated by God to be high priest, not based upon lineage, but in the order of Melchizedek. And so he is that great high priest because he is very Son of God, yet very man. Very Son of God, there exalted, but very Son of man, having been tempted, having yet did not sin, provided the sacrifice, very Son of man, such that he has experienced all that we have experienced. He has been tempted in every way that man has been tempted, yet he did not sin. Therefore, he was able to provide the atoning sacrifice so that we might find help. We might find mercy at God's throne. This is the introduction of the idea of Jesus as high priest that will be developed throughout these next several chapters. We won't look at all the chapters, but we'll look at several of them. But this is the proposition and the introduction that Jesus is the great high priest, that we have and that provides for us the opportunity to enter that rest. Well, in this passage, the writer gives us a couple of exhortations. One, let us hold firmly to the confession that we've made, to that which we profess. Number two, let us approach God's throne of grace boldly, with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in a time of need. What's our need right now? What kind of issues are we facing in our lives today? The writer tells us, and we are reminded today, we have a great high priest. And because he understands us and has provided for us that means of salvation, we can enter God's very presence ourselves through Jesus Christ. We can enter his throne room boldly, with confidence, not arrogantly, but persistently, openly, without fancy words. We simply come to him and pray the prayer that he prayed. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And he will help us. We will find the mercy and the help we need because we have a merciful and faithful high priest there with us. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the reminder of your love. Father, this week as we face situations, some of which may be more crisis-like than others, but regardless of their nature, may we find the strength. May we hold on. Help us that we would hold on to our faith. Help us that we would see that Christ is our high priest, and he has promised to provide for us if we but believe in him. With the Father there in the New Testament, we pray, I believe. Help me in my unbelief. Father, may we this week be faithful servants of yours as we enter your throne room every day with confidence that you hear us and that you love us and that you will supply our need. For it's in the name of the one who invites us, even our high priest, Jesus the Christ, that we pray. Amen. Thank you.